Yes, we are starting. We have a couple of things to sort out. Just bear with us one moment. We are placing a link on Twitter to the YouTube feed where we're going to increasingly focus. All right, I think we are good. Hmm. All right, let me see. There's a delay of sorts. We're trying to figure this out. 1 second. Hmm. 1 second. 1 second. We are experiencing a glitch. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
sure. There's a little broadcasting glitch which is preventing one platform to come on, and it's also affecting the feed. So we have to wait just a second as people join. All right. We should be good to go. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Bassam Haddad, and I will be moderating and to an extent joining this conversation. Uh, let me see. Uh, this is the second part of our conversation on Iran and Israel, titled, this one is titled Lies, Deceit, and Criminality. Israel and the United States attack Iran. This is part two. We are joined by wonderful speakers, Assal Rad, Sina Toossi, Negar Razavi, Mouin Rabbani, as he requested that I pronounce his last name, Naveed Mansouri, and Bassam Haddad, which is myself. I am excited about this conversation. So many of us are, relieved that things are more settled in the past hours for the most part, even though we will talk about some of the complications of the ceasefire, but we are going to go far beyond that. This will be conversational. And I would like to start by, first of all, welcoming everyone. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for the most part. And Asal for joining us for the first time on this series. Um, I would like to start by making a couple of points that we consider the essentials and for which we actually held this event. And the first point is that this is not a thing that ended and now we can have peace. The thing that ended is an actual unprovoked aggression by Israel on Iran that goes counter to international law and all sorts of norms in the so called rules based order. Second, the United States approved or supported the attack in the midst of holding negotiations with Iran, which is a form of great deception. And, people can say, oh, that's how wars work. The issue is that if somebody else did that to the United States, everyone understands what that would mean, right? And third, the region is not going to go back to some sort of peace and prosperity because there is an ongoing genocide perpetrated by Israel in Gaza for almost 2 years now, more than 20 months, 21 months. And the US is a full partner in this genocide, funding, arming, and politically supporting the daily killing that has been taking place since October 8th, 2023, with an average of 100 Palestinians killed every day in the past couple of weeks, people trying to find food and being shot directly, most of them civilians. And these are, of course, they constitute sometimes 40%, sometimes 70% of those are who are killed on a daily basis in Gaza. So the context is not one where we are returning to peace. We are returning to an aggressive settler colonial state that is now conducting genocide with the support of the United States in the Middle East. So for all the maligning and all of the um, talk about Iran being the disruptor, the aggressor, and sponsor of terrorism, all of these things are, for the most part, discursive. But the actual action that's being taking place today is by the United States and Israel in Gaza and beyond. So these are the essentials we're addressing at the outset, so that we don't forget what we are dealing with here. Thank you all again for coming and joining, and those of you who are listening. I'd like to start by, well, let's go with an introduction to actually what had happened, and we had discussed briefly what themes we are going to furnish. So let's start with Sina and Mouin to give us a bit of a background, and then we'll go around and have a discussion, and people can add what they see fit. Sina, would you lead us into the conversation?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me again. Happy to be back on. So we've seen that this war has now reached a ceasefire after 12 days. And when it comes to assessing this war and the durability of this ceasefire, I think it's important to first see, have the Israelis or the U.S. Met their stated objectives, or what seem to be, especially the Israelis' objectives. When Netanyahu launched this attack, as you said, in a surprise sneak attack, he said that they would not stop until they destroy Iran's nuclear, military, and missile capabilities. And it also became very clear that they also had a goal of triggering regime change, that they hoped that by striking Iran's top military leadership, by striking targets like the national media, radio, police stations, they even struck Evin prison in Tehran, um, that this would kind of foment some kind of uprising or mass movement against the Islamic Republic and topple the regime. So on all those objectives, I would argue that Israel has failed. I mean, Iran was its missiles it was firing consistently throughout this conflict. There's very compelling reasons to believe that Iran actually situated itself into a pretty strong position with its missile strikes on Israel, given that it started off by firing very high levels of missiles and barrages that initial like Friday and Saturday, and that reduced in number, but the number of hits actually went up. So suggesting that Israel was diminishing the number of interceptors it had, and Iranian kind of techniques and circumvention techniques and accuracy improved. And we know, like significant targets in Israel will hit, and Iran really, I think one important part of this war was that Iran had a calibrated reaction. I mean, they arguably tried to meet Israel at every escalation step they went up. So, for example, they hit Iranian universities, professors, nuclear scientists, and Iran hit for this Weizmann Institute in Jerusalem, which is also a military and research facility, and really destroyed it. They hit a drone attack, hit the South Pars gas field, and then Iran hit a refinery in Tel Aviv, which resulted in it shutting down and power outages. And this is all in the environment of heavy Israeli military censorship, explicit, overt bans on people within Israel, showing the damage done. I think that's testament to Israel being a pretty fragile society, that it needs this veneer of invincibility and this aura of impenetrability to really maintain this kind of untenable kind of colonialist position in this region, this, prevent immigration, make, the Zionist project feel secure. Um, so, they have this vested interest in downplaying the impact of the Iranian counter strikes. But nevertheless, I mean, this Iran suffered major blows. I don't want to downplay that. Especially, we talked about this last time, Israel's comparative advantage in intelligence and covert attacks, and it basically created this army of infiltrators and agents on the ground that were, attacking sites, sabotage. But we saw, again, I mean, on that point, that Israel failed in any kind of effort to trigger instability in Iran or stoke, unrest, was that we saw a rallying around the flag effect, but more so, I would describe it as a rallying around the nation and the idea of Iran as this kind of country, this polity. And we saw really unprecedented. I mean, for me, it was very striking national solidarity. And in recent years, Iranian society has become very polarized. And there's lots of indicators that many Iranians across political divides, across religious divides, secular, they were very angry and rallied against this Israeli attack. And we also saw a final bit I'll just touch on right now is that this effort to prop up Reza Pahlavi also failed. We can get more into that, but he was kind of the main vessel for this potential regime change project, and that just had no currency within Iran. And so I think a lot of these assumptions about Iran that you hear so much in Washington, even last year, like Iranians missiles are dud, Iran's air defenses are non-existent. After that Israeli attack last year, I mean, Iran suffered, the air superiority. Israel made kind of strides in getting air superiority, seemingly. I mean, we still don't know a lot, but Iran did shoot down a lot of Hermes drones. There's unconfirmed reports of potential Israeli jets shot down. We'll see what comes out in the coming days. But this idea of, this totally being one-sided, this victory narrative that's, the Israelis would like to push, this backfired. And, ultimately, what does it achieve? Iran's nuclear program is seemingly still intact. I mean, it's unclear what damage the U.S. strikes did, but according to reports, Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium and advanced centrifuges were moved, which means it still has a breakout capability to build a bomb if it decides to. So strategically, it seems like this didn't achieve that much for Israel.
Mouin, would you like to share with us sort of the maybe the broader sort of scene and something about the different actors and their
Sure.
motivations, and then we'll move to Asal, Negar, and Naveed.
Sure. Thank you. Pleasure to be with all of you. I learned a lot during our last webinar, and particularly, Sina, you had an outstanding thread or threads on Twitter yesterday, which I thought were really informative. Just a small correction: the Weizmann Institute is actually in a southern suburb of Tel Aviv, and the oil refinery is in Haifa, not Tel Aviv. I think the question is, since everyone was expecting a prolonged war and an intensification of the conflict, why it suddenly ended. What were the motivations for each of the parties? And here I think the most important party to look at is the United States, because as I've been, the point I've been making now for a while is that Israel's decisions of war and peace are not made in Israel, but rather they're made in the White House. And it's, you have situations where the U.S. subcontracts the decision to Israel or allows Israel to do as it sees fit. But when the United States considers that a decision on war and peace is important for U.S. national security or regional interests, then the decision is made by the Americans, and the Israelis do as they're told. And I think this is a key to understanding what happened yesterday. Yes, the United States directly participated in an unprovoked act of aggression against Iran when it launched these bombing raids last Saturday on the three Iranian nuclear sites. But even then, I mean, if you look at what the US did, it was not a wide scale air campaign. Rather, they were three raids on three specific sites, and that was it. And the only follow up that was given was a statement by Trump that it was an astounding success, resulted in the complete obliteration of these sites, and so on, and a warning to Iran not to retaliate. So that already, I think, gave us an indication that there was a divergence between the U.S. and Israeli agenda. As I won't repeat what Sina just said, but it was quite clear that Israel was pushing for regime change, while for the Americans, it was about degrading, destroying Iran's nuclear program in order to improve Washington's negotiating position with the Islamic Republic. And I think the Americans also came to the conclusion that as far as degrading Iran's nuclear weapons program, its ballistic missile program, its military capabilities, and so on, Israel was not going to achieve more by continuing the war, and that a continuation of the war would change the objectives of the war, at least as far as the Americans are concerned, because they didn't see this from the beginning, would change it to a regime change war, which the Trump administration was not particularly interested in. It risked setting the entire region on fire, and in so doing would further draw in the Americans, and additionally would intensify what amounts to a civil war within the MAGA cult and the broader Republican Party. They were, you know, the cult was divided between those who were absolutely opposed to Israel's war with Iran, against Iran, who were even more opposed to US involvement in Israel's war against Iran, versus those who wanted to go all the way. Trump, in a sense, didn't care one way or the other because he's primarily about himself, but he is the leader of this personality cult. So what he thinks and does is of enormous consequence. And I think, you know, the opposition from within the cult to this war was quite consequential, in the sense that, on the one hand, it didn't stop the U.S. direct bombing of Iran, but I do feel it played a role in the U.S. decision to pursue a ceasefire. And the other thing, of course, is that, as Sina noted, Israeli missile defenses were being degraded and depleted. So you take all these factors together, and there was, I think, a clear motivation for the US to pursue a ceasefire. Now, regarding the the Iranian retaliatory attack on the Al-Udeid US Air Force Base in Qatar yesterday, I think you can look at it two ways. It was a telegraphed, choreographed missile attack on an evacuated airbase that had all the impact of a series of harmless firecrackers. That's certainly true. And I think it was specifically designed not to cause casualties. But at the same time, not only did the US not respond as it had threatened to do, but it demonstrated that if the Iranians felt their backs were against the wall, they were prepared to escalate regionally. They were prepared to burn the bridges that they've built with the Arab states on the other side of the Persian Gulf, relationships which they had been assiduously cultivating for many years. So, it showed the Americans, on the one hand, that the Iranians were not interested in further escalation, but also that they would be prepared to further escalate if there was no off ramp. So those I think were the American calculations. The Israelis are in a more complex position. On the one hand, yes, they have inflicted enormous damage on Iran, particularly with the opening salvo. And I'm not going to repeat what the points that Sina made, but basically, the Israelis had a determination to conduct a short, sharp, decisive war. And it was turning into a prolonged war without a clear outcome, in which the damage on Israel was escalating, and the situation in which Iran appeared to be in a better position to absorb the costs of a prolonged war than was Israel. Nevertheless, I believe the Israelis were determined to continue until they succeeded in meeting at least some of their objectives, or failing that, getting into a situation where the Americans would once again become directly involved. My sense is that Trump, who has supported the various Israeli negotiation demands, their initial attack on Iran, and so on, because he was snookered and led to believe that what was really happening were measures to improve Washington's negotiating position, I think finally realized he was being led down the garden path. And I think when you look at his outburst today, I mean, when was the last time you saw an American president criticizing Israel in public, as opposed to cursing them in private and then getting up in public and saying Israel is an angel, it's all the other guy's fault? I think that shows the level of frustration. And the real question now is this just an outburst, or could it be a turning point which can also be exploited to call time on Israel's genocide in the Gaza Strip? I don't see that happening automatically. I think there's a slim opportunity that this could be leveraged and mobilized that way. So I think from the Israeli point of view, um, they failed to, I think Sina made exactly this point. When you start a war, the onus is on you to achieve at least some of your objectives. And apart from dealing painful blows to the Iranians, the Israelis have not achieved any of their. They have scored enormous tactical successes, but not a single strategic objective. And at the conclusion, they are also now at loggerheads with Washington, probably temporary, but significant nonetheless when you're so absolutely dependent on your patron. And from the Iranian point of view, they have said from the very outset that this is an Israeli war of aggression against their country, and they wanted to stop immediately. And provided the Israelis stop firing, they will too. Well, that appears to have finally happened. My understanding is that there are those in Iran who felt Israel is on the back foot, its missile defenses were no longer up to standard, and that Iran could have inflicted even more pain on Israel had the war continued. But clearly, cooler heads prevailed, because Iran would also pay an enormous price, particularly because its own air defenses were so severely degraded and not being replenished by Russia or China. Now, moving forward, a sustainable ceasefire requires a political process, a significant political process. And here there's a very big question mark. Will Israel be allowed by the United States to turn this into a Lebanon type ceasefire, where the ceasefire applies strictly to Iran, but Israel can violate it at will? I suspect that's not going to be the formula, because Iran has a much stronger capacity to respond in kind than does Hezbollah in Lebanon. What about renewed U.S. Iranian negotiations? Well, for Israel, one of the key objectives was derailing those negotiations. But the situation we have now, I believe, is one where Iran will reject any new negotiations with the Americans unless and until the Americans recognize Iran's rights to enrich uranium to low levels for civilian purposes on their own territory, as guaranteed by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and take this business of Iran's ballistic missile program and its regional alliances off the agenda. That's not going to happen overnight. It might not happen at all, and it could give Israel the wedge it needs to kind of renew the maximum pressure campaign on Iran. So we'll have to see about that. And then the other question, of course, is the significant pressure that's going to be exercised on the Iranian leadership, both from within its own circles and I suspect also from the broader Iranian public, to withdraw from the NPT, to expel the IAEA inspectors who may already be gone, if I'm not mistaken, and to no longer use Iran's status as a nuclear threshold state as leverage in negotiations with the West, but to use it to acquire the ultimate deterrent. In other words, for Iran to go nuclear. Again, I think these are unanswered questions, and we'll know more in a few months, I guess.
Thanks, Mouin. I wanted to say something about the length of time, but you are always also going to speak again, I hope. We would like to turn to Assal, and given that Assal was not with us last time, I'll say a couple words about Assal. In Arabic, Assal, but you guys are, you pronounce it without the ha, so I'll say Assal until you correct me, Assal. She's a scholar of Middle East history. Her writing can be seen in Newsweek, The National Interest, The Independent, Foreign Policy, and more. She appeared literally everywhere on network television and beyond. And she is author of the book titled "The State of Resistance: Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran," out of Cambridge University Press, 2002. And in fairness, a couple words about Toossi for those who are joining us for the first time, or Sina, is a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy. His work focuses on producing research and analysis on U.S. Iran relations, U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East, and nuclear policy issues. And of course, his writings appeared. I don't know why I said of course, but his writings did appear in many venues, including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and USA Today, among other places. Mouin, those who are following us are probably able to repeat this, literally, like word by word. He served as Principal Political Affairs Officer with the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, head of Middle East with the Marty Ahtisaari Peace Foundation, and he's also a senior Middle East analyst and special advisor on Israel Palestine with the International Crisis Group, or he was.
Was.
And Rabbani is co-editor of Jadaliyya. With that, let's move to Assal. If you can tell us, Assal, those of us who follow you on a daily basis are really indebted to the manner in which you critique the framing of anything that we are observing in the region, and particularly Iran and to a very large extent Israel-Palestine, especially in the past 2 years. Can you share with us your views on this topic and anything else you wish to introduce to us?
Well, I think we've covered obviously the sort of analysis of where we're at and what are the different options. So I'll leave that part behind and we can just focus on the media aspect, which shouldn't be surprising, right? The way that the media has framed the Gaza genocide has been to not call it a genocide, and to not attribute blame for that genocide to the one committing it, which is Israel. So that's been the overall, if I was to just give a very brief synopsis of how has the media covered the Gaza genocide, that would be it. This was not new. It's just more egregious when you look at the level of atrocity that we've seen in Gaza over the last 21 months. It's the way that the Palestinian Liberation Movement, that Palestine, Israel-Palestine, the Middle East more broadly, wars in Iraq, the war on terror, everything is framed has always been extremely problematic. But it's just that I think it's become more clear for people to see because you can juxtapose the way that legacy media is framing what's happening in Gaza and the actual footage that we are seeing every single day. So it's very difficult for people for the public to digest the idea that slaughtered children, seeing people burned alive, seeing mothers and fathers searching the rubble for their children, children wailing because they've been orphaned, and seeing their entire family killed, seeing these scenes every single day, and then looking at the way that the media is depicting these horrors every single day. So if you look at the way that Israel's initial attack on Iran was framed, there was no, I mean, there's just, it's as if the media is always justifying Israel's actions. Words like, illegal, international law violation, sovereignty, none of that language gets used. The language that you saw initially was preemptive strikes. And of course, that's reminiscent of 2003, the US invasion of Iraq, preemptive strikes to stop Saddam Hussein's WMDs, which didn't exist. And everybody knew at the time that they didn't exist. But now we know, looking back as fact, they did not exist. And so when they use that language, preemptive strike implies that there's an imminent threat, that Iran's about to attack Israel, and Israel has no choice but to preemptively stop that attack by attacking them first. That's clearly not what was happening. Iran, I think now, these last 12 days prove beyond the shadow of a doubt, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, right? Because if they did, now would have been the time to say, hey, this is a deterrence that we have. So the whole idea that Iran has nuclear weapons should be put aside. We now know that definitively that they don't. All of the evidence from US intelligence and the IAEA already pointed to that fact, but Israel doesn't care about facts. So the language of preemptive strike was the first problem. Then after that, then once Iran retaliates, the language of retaliation is not used. It's as if Iran is this belligerent state that is going after Israel, when in fact, Iran is the state that's being attacked and now retaliating in kind. So that kind of language has been used throughout this 2-week period. You even see it today. I mean, there was a New York Times headline. God, the New York Times. There was a New York Times headline that said, I'm paraphrasing, but it was something about Iran's deadly strikes on Israel before the ceasefire took effect. Something to that effect is the headline. No mention of the fact that Israel, right after President Trump announces the ceasefire, it just barrage it like a missile barrage across Iran. There you have massive attacks, which President Trump himself called. I mean, he said, what did he call it? He said, the likes of which he's never seen. That's the attack that Israel carried out right after President Trump announced a ceasefire, but that is not part of the story that's told. It's Iran's response, again, to Israel's initial attack after the ceasefire is announced. That's the part of the story that you hear, and you saw this from the Associated Press, you saw this from the New York Times, and that's generally how the whole thing has been framed. On top of that, the idea that Israel, again, targets, it's the same language that's used in Gaza, that Israel is targeting and not hitting civilians, even though Iran's civilian death toll is many times larger than that of Israel's. The language of that essentially justifies all of Israel's actions, and there's barely any coverage of civilian casualties in Iran, despite the fact that they're many times larger. But if there's any kind of casualty on the Israeli side, this becomes a news story. You have headlines because Israelis are victims, Iranians are collateral damage that are barely even covered as something to talk about, or the damage that is being done in Iran. That is barely talked about. The focus has predominantly been on what is happening to Israel, the aggressor in the war, and not the victim of the aggression, which was Iran. I mean, that's just a fact. If you attack a country, you're the aggressor. But that's not the way that it was depicted at all.
Thank you, Assal. Negar, you're up. And at this point, given that we did cover some grounds and we did cover actually quite a bit of background last time, please feel free to focus on anything you feel needs to be highlighted.
Sure. I want to highlight two things. Is my voice coming through okay? Okay. The
Yes.
criminality aspect of our title is where I'm going to start. Um, what the US and Israel did was not just kill civilians, as Assal just mentioned, they also terrorized the population for the past week. Um, Twice, Trump tweeted for all of Tehran to evacuate in the middle of the night. Okay? Via tweet, he terrorized between 10 to 12 million people, same size as Sweden, to evacuate in the middle of the night. And a lot of people did, or they tried, and those who couldn't stayed behind thinking that at any moment the United States was going to destroy them. Okay? Then the Israelis bombed areas that many people had escaped to, such as the northern part of Iran that sits on the Caspian. Okay? And then the third thing Trump did was to consistently change uh, the goalposts or the reasons for why he was doing this. So every 6 to 12 hours, roughly, he was changing the reason why the US was going in. And this was very confusing to the people on the ground inside Iran. At first, it was about WMDs. The US is supporting Israel because they have a nuclear weapon, right? What Assal was saying about the preemptive strike. Then Trump is questioning why Iran has a nuclear program to begin with, which, by the way, Iran has a nuclear program because the United States gave it one in the 1950s under President Eisenhower. Okay. Then they turn to women, and I'm going to pick this up as my second point, that they're somehow going in to save Iranian women and to, protect queer Iranians from their evil regime. And again, I'm going to come to that in a minute. And then when they realized that wasn't really working, they vaguely talked about regime change and then they backed away completely. So I do want to set the record straight that they may not have achieved their military or strategic goals, but they did terrorize a population for an entire week, and we shouldn't dismiss that in any of our analysis. So that was my first point. The second was about this point about saving Iranian women, and I do feel if anybody else wants to jump in on this as well, we know it's bad whenever the United States talks about saving your country's women, right? It's imperial deja vu. It's very intentionally connecting itself to a longer colonial history. The U.S. has done it so many times that we shouldn't be falling for it, but yet here we are. And it's so old and so racist and so hypocritical, given what the United States is doing to women in this country and to the LGBTQ community here, that the only reason I'm bringing it up is because I want to refuse it in no uncertain terms on this, in this discussion. And by that, I mean, I don't want to give our viewers or listeners any statistics about Iranian women's education or advancement, because I feel like that plays into the US and Israel imperial playbook. Instead, I just want to say that Iranian women have been at the forefront of social and political change inside the country for over a century, and most recently through the Jina Revolution, which Bibi has had the audacity to try to co-opt for his own sick imperialist gains. And if Americans can't be bothered to read the news or a history book, including Assad's work, we as Iranian women, both inside and outside the country, do not need to do their work for them. Their deception banks on us wasting our time and energy trying to refute arguments that are so deeply hypocritical. So that I bring it up only to refuse the basis of that argument. And just a shout out to two groups of women that I've been working with, feminist groups that I've been working with for the past week, who've been helping me in my own thinking through all of this horror. The Kuche Collective here in DC and the Empire Working Group of anthropologists that I've been working with. They've really been helping me think through how to recenter complexity, the human and relational analysis in our work as we move forward. So I will pass it on to Naveed.
Let me interrupt one more time. Since we are doing things backwards in terms of the bio, this was Negar. Just a couple words because we are moving, a bit faster, and I would like to say a word about Negar and then Naveed before you speak. So this way you're introduced properly. Negar is an associate research scholar at the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. Thank you, Negar, for your comments. And our next speaker is Naveed Mansouri. And Naveed is a political theorist and a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. And his areas of research include histories and theories of media and mediation, anti and decolonial history and theory, critical theory, Iranian studies, and Middle East studies. With all of these expertise issues, Naveed, and titles, I am surprised that you're still in the country.
Me too. So I thank you so much for inviting me again. I just wanted to pick up on what I want. I think that it's good to always be shocked when the United States and Europe violate the rules of the rules-based order. It's good to constantly be shocked because at the least that means that we're still alive and feeling things. But at this point, it would be. I think it betrays a little bit of our naivete if we continue to hold on to this idea that the United States and Europe have fidelity to the rules-based order. Since the aftermath of the Second World War, the United States has regularly and almost proudly violated these rules. And when I talk about the rules-based order, I'm talking about human rights. I'm talking about international law. I'm talking about the United Nations Charter. I'm talking about the idea that nation states are sovereign and that their territorial integrity is to be preserved. And you look at what the United States has done. I mean, I think a conservative estimate from the Washington Post, so not a liberal news outlet, is that the United States has made 72 attempts at regime change since World War II, and I think the upward number for that is about 131. And the thing is that American politicians, state officials, they don't even try to hide it anymore. In 2022, John Bolton was doing an interview on CNN, and he just readily admitted to planning coups. We know that the United States has regularly participated in illegal wars and interventions. We talked about, the George Bush administration intervening in Iraq, bypassing Congress, doing so without UN approval, and predicated on, as Assal was saying, retrospectively, a lie that the United States has participated in proxy wars in Vietnam and Korea and Afghanistan and Nicaragua and Angola and Syria and all sorts of places. And also using sanctions as a tool of economic warfare. And when we look at this, and I don't mean to just go through and provide a laundry list of all of the ways in which the United States has broken the rules of the rules-based order just for its own sake. What I want to try to say here is that when another country, usually a country in the global south, breaks those rules in a real or perceived way, the issue that the first world, that the United States and the Europe take with it is not that they have broken those rules for its own sake. It's that those countries are challenging the monopoly that the United States and Europe want on strategic rule breaking. And so I think that's how we should look at this. That's when we're trying to look at the framing that Assal has been sort of revealing through her headline fixing. Of course Israel can just randomly initiate an attack on Iran and get backing from the United States and have NATO immediately celebrating it. And when Iran, responds, of course it's going to be seen as Iran as actually the rogue state, precisely because from the aftermath of the Second World War, the idea was that these rules are not universally applied, that these rules are effectively have been conceived to set constraints upon the global South to try to basically assert its sovereignty. I mean, it's and with Iran especially, I mean, we see this if we want to look at a specific example. There has been a pattern of coercion that the United States has demonstrated, a pattern of coercion with Iran. I mean, this is starting from not necessarily say even we can start like after the revolution. Last time I already talked about the 53 coup. I think that's something a lot of people listening already know about. But we know that like during just looking at how the United States treated Iran during the Iran-Iraq war, that on the one hand, while it was giving material support to Saddam Hussein, you had that at the same time the Iran-Contra affair. I mean, these are people who have literally no concern for all of the civilian life that is being lost. Or at least it makes that civilian loss secondary to the most shallow and superficial of material interests. And by the 2000s, especially after 9/11, you basically get the criminalization of sovereignty when the Bush administration comes and labels Iran and places it on the axis of evil. And this was like heightened hypocrisy and contradiction, by the way, because Al-Qaeda emerges out of the landscape of the Soviet-Afghan war when the United States had actually trained, the CIA had actually trained the Mujahideen in its war against the Soviet Union. And so, the sort of and in 2003, if you remember, even despite the fact that it was placed on the axis of evil, Iran actually came with what was called a grand bargain, offering nuclear transparency, offering even recognition of Israel, and it was completely ignored until of course the recent years with the JCPOA, the nuclear deal that just on a whim, Trump can come and basically shred the nuclear deal apart, assassinate Bassam Soleimani, and still have the gall to claim the moral high ground as a country that somehow adheres or is true to this thing we call the rules-based order. And so I think the question we should be asking is something we should stop asking simply who's breaking the rules, but actually asking to what end are the rules being broken. That's what because when we ask who is breaking the rules, we're obscuring the content, the actual the substance of the act. Like, why is the U.S. breaking international law, enforcing regional order in the Middle East, preserving Israel's military dominance, protecting it while it conducts a genocide in Gaza, and punishing disobedient states? So this is just coercion. It has been coercion masquerading as consensus. And I saw in the comments, someone asking, are we sure that the ceasefire will hold? And in the short term, maybe. I'm not sure. I mean, again, I don't have the powers. I'm not a seer, but we know already, just in the way in which these relations of power are situated, that when that the very existence of Iran to the United States is an example of unpermitted sovereignty. That the global South is not permitted sovereignty, and that any time that it acts in a way where it asserts its own self-determination, whether it was in 53, in 79, or in recent years, it's not the actual regime that's at question. It's whether or not that sovereign actor is going to be at the beck and call of Western powers. So this is like a core contradiction. I think we should continue to be surprised, because that means at least we're feeling something and that we're alive. But if we have like a historical sensibility, you see that this isn't really that surprising at all. And so I think that's how I would frame this in the sort of grander perspective, and I think I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Naveed. I have a few things to say, which sort of expand on some of the essential points I tried to address early on, but I'll wait until a bit later. Sina, would you please share with us or take us through the domestic landscape in Iran, and how all of this has reflected on it or is seen by the various domestic actors, and in particular regarding this wishful thinking by people. I mean, I don't understand. These people have a lot of money, they've had good education, they can read, and still they thought that if you strike a country, the people of that country are going to basically rise up. And of course, the exact opposite happened. And if you can tell us the details about this. But let me interject with one thing that actually helps us understand why they said that. It's because of the subpar analysts that dominate network television in the United States and potentially Israel. I don't think that's the case in Israel, because they pay more attention than our analysts. This idea that, oh, look what happened in Syria, things just fell apart. All you had to do is, have Hezbollah degraded next door and so on. Syria has nothing to do, the Syria's quote unquote, the regime falling apart has nothing to do with any external hit or anything of the sort, in the sense that the main issue in Syria is that there was a devastating uprising slash war slash international intervention slash external designs to do XYZ for 14 years that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, mostly by the regime and its supporters, but also significantly in massive amount by the opposition and its supporters, which is always neglected when we talk about the hundreds of thousands killed in Syria, with the caveat that it's always the regime that has the largest share, of course. And they tried to compare the two and say, oh, you just hit and all of a sudden people will rally against the regime and so on. So the Syria example, for the love of whatever you're into, whoever is speaking, listening, it is a completely different situation. And we're talking about the leadership in Syria that has fallen out of favor, not just vis-a-vis its enemies or the people it repressed for decades inside Syria, but also had fallen out of favor with its own allies, Hezbollah and Iran, way before November 2024, when the regime actually withered, not even collapsed, because things just fell apart, and the president slash dictator just escaped, left without a word. So no more Syria analogies, please. Sina, sorry, take us to Iran.
Yes, thank you. I'll attempt to take a pass at your question. With regard to the domestic situation in Iran, we've seen this. I mean, actually, first I should get to this point you made about analysts. That was very good. I mean, Negar has done some great kind of critiques of the Iran policy landscape in Washington, D.C., and this is also a landscape I've kind of been active in on the progressive lefty side of these discussions, not at all in the mainstream. But, it's very obvious that it is an echo chamber that advances people who kind of say what the kind of hawkish establishment forces want to hear. So, the establishment, these forces want to be told that, the Iranian people want to be liberated, that, Iran is weak for XYZ reason, a war would be easy. And, that's what gets you to move up in Washington, in the kind of establishment think tanks, the kind of a lot of the mainstream media. And so there is an element of self-delusion, groupthink, people just echoing the same kind of cliche talking points. And the thing that really strikes me is that even in the face of like blatant evidence, this stuff, they still kind of push this stuff, like even last year, for example, when, Iran's October missile strike against Israel, you see all this footage of missiles striking, hitting, targets, evading the Israel's multi-layered air defense system. And people are still like, oh, like Iran has, the missiles are kaput. They're nothing. They're just showing their weakness. Even like very journalists, we have many activist journalists as well, like at the Wall Street Journal, Barak Ravid, who's become a very much a kind of interlocutor for the Israeli government and its interests, and who gets, he has a lot of accurate reporting. But at the same time, I remember just a couple of weeks ago, he was he had some tweets saying that, Iran's missiles are nothing, Iran's airspace is totally vulnerable, all this stuff. And we can see, okay, so in 12 days that, they had to reach a ceasefire. I mean, I guarantee you that if Iran was as weak as these people have said, that this war would be continuing, just like it's continuing in Gaza. And ultimately, to Naveed's points about, them violating the international rules and norms and these things, this is a system that they created themselves, and the rules clearly don't apply to them. And I believe that, power is the ultimate currency of the international system. And the reason this war has stopped, and the reason if it continues to stop, will depend on Iran's kind of military capabilities, its ability to hit Israel, its ability to enact a cost for them. And I think even the attack on Al Udeid, might not have inflicted damage, but it caused a lot of panic in Qatar. There's scenes of people evacuating malls. The UAE apparently shut down its airspace. So, that's a card that Iran can play, like you said, Bassam, that destabilizing the Persian Gulf at a very high level of escalation would be harmful for America's global position, for these allies, for energy exports. It can get really costly for the global economy and for Trump. So with that said, I mean, with respect to the Iranian domestic situation, there's this, and another part of this lopsided war, and I would really situate this in a post-colonial context of like, we're still in the period of post-European colonialism, or the kind of late stage of it, I would argue, where, what we deem to be the global South, or Middle East, Asia, Latin America, Africa, for one reason or another, they fell behind European and then American hegemony over the world. And that is really, I think, of the meta picture that's what's being challenged. And that's even at the crux of a lot of these conflicts that we're seeing in the Middle East, and this obsession with Israel or Ukraine or Taiwan, to preserve this kind of American global hegemony. So, the other lopsided part of this is not just this power imbalance, which is changing in some important ways, but also the information war. So, the Israelis are superb at the information war, propaganda, Hasbara, the American media, and oftentimes they can shape reality, and if you follow these issues closely, you can see how blatantly manipulative it is, but they'll shape it, they'll craft a narrative, and our media in this country, and this Iran war was very much an example of this, that for as much as we feign an independent media and having a free press and being this democratic society, at least when it comes to a lot of the legacy media, mainstream media, and I don't want to like cast them all in a broad brush, but it's very clear that, the national security state has its priorities, has its goals, and that trickles down to what the main networks cover, what the main newspapers cover, the line that they take, not unlike any authoritarian state. It's more sophisticated. And I also don't want to discount that we do have alternative media, and that's important. But so for the Iranian people, the narrative has been that the people want the Islamic Republic gone, at all costs, that, the Israelis had pushed this narrative that, all it takes is one more push. That's always what it's kind of been. Even if you look at like what Reza Pahlavi said in 2005, trying to get American support for intervention against Iran, then it was just, one more push. This is a very fragile regime, one more push and it's done. And obviously that's not the case. I mean, Iran is a complex society like any other society, diverse opinions. It's not monolithic in any way. And it has become much more polarized in recent years. But we saw that, once the bombs started dropping, once Iranian kids started being killed, hospitals were struck, as Negar said, evacuation orders sent at 2 a.m. to 10 million people, that this is clearly not about, the Islamic Republic, or, it's kind of, that it is the root of the problem for Israel and America, that, people saw this as an attack on Iran as a country, as this kind of strategic actor in the region, and this aim that was really aimed at not regime change. I mean, the aspiration is for regime change, but they'll be perfectly happy with regime collapse or state collapse, and I think unlike Bush, who wanted to, there was this idea of nation building that took root, like we broke Afghanistan and Iraq, we'll try to fix it, quote unquote. But, Obama created, advanced this notion of break it and leave it with Libya, that's still in a civil war 15 years later. No one talks about it. And Iran, I'm sure they would be perfectly happy to have Iran collapse into chaos and civil war, and Israel is just this fortress Israel that rules over the region, over all these impoverished, chaotic, situation for other countries. But yeah, so we've seen this situation where it's really really striking, where from prominent actors, activists, pro-democracy activists like Mustafa Tajzadeh or Zahra Rahnavard, all rally around against this attack, condemning this attack, saying this is not how you bring about positive democratic change to Iran. On the you see many young kids. It's been another just being on Iranian Instagram and seeing these things that have been going viral in the past week or two, like young Gen Z Iranian kids, girls without the hijab, kind of lashing out at Israel, trying to promote this kind of solidarity, and I think so this has created a really interesting moment in Iran, where arguably widespread consensus right now against this war, for Iran's kind of territorial integrity, sovereignty. So I think whether or not this moment is capitalized on, and if it kind of lasts, I think will have to do with also how the Islamic Republic ultimately does change after this. Like, will they revert to their typical kind of more insular policies, certain social restrictions, political restrictions, or will they see this as a moment where, when push came to shove, the majority of society rallied behind the country and kind of opened things up domestically and try to, tap more into Iran's very impressive human capital? I think another part of this war is that Iran was fighting the U.S., not just Israel, but Israel backed by the U.S., backed by the European powers. And it was just alone. There's no real evidence of really tangible, meaningful support from even China or Russia, and it was its own indigenous capabilities that it built up over decades, its missile program, its own indigenous air defense systems. And so, yeah, I think, it ultimately needs its own people, the state, whatever shape it takes. And so I think there is a possibility of some kind of, the governance style potentially changing. And I do see a lot of calls for that in Iran. But we'll have to see if it's just a reversion, if kind of more, I don't think the religious hardliners will necessarily be ascendant after this. Certainly the more kind of just national security hardliners are very validated in Iran right now, and they might try to consolidate more power, like the IRGC generals. But, it's a moment that if the Islamic Republic were smart, it would try to capitalize on this kind of sentiment in the country and adopt a more inclusive governance style that could allow it to kind of better just rely on its own population and, develop and defend itself as well.
Can I add
Thank.
to
Yeah, I do. I was gonna come. Yeah, I was gonna come to you next, Asal. But I wanted to prep this by you throwing something out here, which you tweeted. And by the way, on my bookmarks, I bookmark some tweets, for various purposes, and I think you are the person I bookmark the most. So I just want to say I'm indebted to you. And so many people are for your interjections online, on X, to be specific. You wrote a one of the tweets which is unlike what you usually write. So I'm going to bring it up, and it's actually important. If you can address it or not, you can keep going and address what Sina was addressing. You write, the Middle East is not a volatile region naturally plagued with war and violence. It's the cradle of civilization, home to hundreds of millions of people who have had violence imposed on them by colonists and foreign powers for centuries. And then you go on to address how there's no greater crime than genocide, yet the Western world justifies it when it's against Palestinians. Unprovoked wars force people to flee from their homes, yet the Western world rejects the refugees they create. Bombing and sanctioning innocent people to death is lauded as a success, yet the Western world boasts about their civilized rules-based order. The reason for not understanding these basic facts and hypocrisies is called racism. Um, so I just wanted to highlight that part of
Yeah, I'm
your.
usually more pithy. So that
Sorry.
was, I said I'm usually more pithy, so that was a little bit long.
No, well, you usually, this is its own pithy like intervention, but yeah, usually address the framing, and this is actually, this captures so much of the deceit and double standards we observe. Yet, because of the overwhelming power that which lies on one side of the quote unquote equation, these things are brushed over, but not for the global population. It's brushed over for a small, tiny bit of people who wield power. Unfortunately, sorry, floor is yours.
No, I mean that point. At that point can actually be linked to what Sina was talking about, because look, there's an entire history that most of the world is not aware of, because not everybody studies history. I'm a historian, that's my job to do that, but not everybody's. And that's not a question of like, why don't people have this public knowledge? I don't have knowledge about a whole slew of other issues that other people do. But when you're having these conversations, when our country, when the United States is constantly in when our tax dollars, our weapons are being used in a certain manner, then it becomes more important to understand this context, because it affects our current policies. And you have this whole history where the Middle East has basically been, for the last 2.5 centuries, colonized. You have colonialism, imperialism, the language of Orientalism that has basically made the idea that the region is somehow on a civilizational level or a racial, cultural level inferior to that of the West. And this is justified actions. And that should sound familiar. It's the same kind of logic that was used to commit genocide in an entire hemisphere of the planet, the one that we're currently standing on. And it's the same kind of language that was used to justify slavery, right? This is the kind of language that is used to justify subjugating another people over and over again. And we don't think of it as being relevant to these conversations because of this notion of the international rules-based order, and the Western world is so civilized and we have all these rules, so we don't do these bad things that used to be done. That's just not the case, and this becomes normalized in a way that people, that's how propaganda works. They just repeat it over and over again until you start to think, well, I've heard that before. Israel has the right to exist, and that's it. There's no question about anything that goes on after that. Israel has the right to defend itself. You've never heard in the English language, as a point that's repeatedly made, Palestinians have the right to defend themselves. Iran has the right to defend itself. Lebanon has the right to defend itself. But that's not a catchphrase that you're familiar with, because nobody ever repeats it. And that's the sort of asymmetry that exists, that basically says this one group of people, or a specific group of people, has certain rights and these other people simply don't. And that is based on nothing else but racism. Now, how does this connect to Sina's point? Why you might have I liked that you said rallying around the nation rather than rallying around the flag, because there's a distinction between defending the homeland, which for Iranians specifically, this is true of all nations, but Iranians have what they view as a very long historical narrative. The country is seen as a very old country because they see connections back to the Persian Empire of 2,500 years ago. That's different. There's no such, that history, for instance, doesn't exist in the United States. The US is 250 years old. That's our history. In the Iranian psyche, it's 2,500 years old. And so it's a very potent kind of symbolism and nationalism that can be used. And that is about the map and the territorial integrity. And when that is being threatened, all those the events of the colonial past become present, because while Americans might not remember their history very well, Iranians do. Iranians will, like an average Iranian will reference the Treaty of Turkmenchai from the first half of the 19th century as if it's just, a very normal sort of turn of phrase to use. And so when you have an Israeli, fairly, centrist, not even particularly extreme paper like the Jerusalem Post, their editorial board coming out and not only pushing for Trump to enter the war, for regime change, but also to partition Iran, that will hit that sort of nationalist sentiment very, very quickly. And that should be clear to anyone. You could argue that many, many, many peoples across the world are very angry with their governments. You could argue that that's the case in the United States right now. But does that mean that we would invite a foreign power to come in? A foreign power, by the way, that's committing genocide and clearly has no concern for human life, international law, democracy, anything, right? It's just the language that's used. Again, what's another catchphrase you hear over and over again? The only democracy in the Middle East. Except you can't be an apartheid state and be a democracy. You can't control the lives of millions of people who are not represented and have no rights and then say you are a democracy. So again, these phrases get used over and over again, and people start to believe that it's common knowledge. But when you start to scratch the surface, you realize that there is no rational basis behind these statements. The reality is much more complicated, and people in the region, especially those who have lived through so many, endless wars around them, understand this. So attacking the country is not likely to have the kind of impact that, say, the US or Israel would have wanted. If they want a regime change war, they will likely need boots on the ground to accomplish that. They thought their boots on the ground would be Iranians themselves. And that should tell you something about what they think about Iranian lives. They're sacrificial. Well, if all of you die, it doesn't matter. We're not dying. Americans aren't going to die. Israelis aren't going to die. Iranians are going to die, so that they can accomplish their political goals, which have very little to do with the livelihoods or benefits of Iranian people. Because why would they? Why would a state that feels perfectly comfortable starving an entire civilian population and then shooting at people as they try to get food, why would that state think we're here to save people? It's an absurd claim. And I think that's something that people understood. I mean, that many, many Iranians understood, that they could be simultaneously against their own government and an attack on their country that is killing their neighbors or their own family members, destroying their infrastructure, destroying their homes.
I've been given the green light that I can just jump in now. Assal, I'm going to highlight a point that complements what you just said. And I think one of the starting premises that's faulty in Washington's analysis of Iran is they treat the Iranian people, like a monolith, which in itself is a de-exceptionalizing of the Iranian people, because no people are a monolith, right? And especially Iranians, they do not agree on anything. That's something we pride ourselves on. Ask any two Iranians where the best kebab place is in X city, and you will have 10,000 answers from those two people, right? So one of them is that the Iranian people are a monolith, and therefore we can just, if we have our token Iranian on our side, they can tell us what all Iranians think, right? Whether that's Reza Pahlavi or a member of the MEK, or even somebody who's very well intentioned. I have to consistently tell people in Washington, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. I have my biases. I have my assumptions. I represent a particular faction. Do not take what I say as a stand-in for all Iranian people. So that's one thing. The second thing I want to say is that it is very difficult to do the kind of polling that we do in other countries, because Iran is still a relatively closed society, right? So there is some polling that has come out, including the Iran Social Survey, that is one of the best in terms of its methods and its ability to access people inside Iran. And what it shows is exactly what I just said, which is that people hold complex, contradictory ideas. So the same person might tell you that they oppose the regime, but they do not want Iran to become a destabilized entity. Or the same person will tell you, I want a democracy, but I still want religion to be a part of our political system. And Washington does not allow for any of these complexities to exist. It wants to make the Iranian people this blob that it can then control or move in one direction or another. And I feel that it is important that we step back and and directly challenge that kind of analysis within this group. And I think all of us have tried to do that, is to show that there are factions, there are different groups, they're contending with one another.
Sorry. Yeah, I wanted to pick up on this, the sort of what the apparent contradiction between, like people wanting to affect social transformation of their own country, while also having an ambivalent relationship between sort of the inequalities within their own country and their relationship to their own state. And I think, I'm born and raised in the United States, and American history is something I'm also a student of. And so the mid 20th century civil rights movement to me is a really actually illustrative and insightful example to think about for two reasons. One is the timeline, that it didn't happen in a day. The end of Reconstruction was 1877. That was the sort of period from 65 to 77, which was Reconstruction. After 77, you had the beginning of Jim Crow, and that would last, at least in the conventional historiography, from 64 with the Civil Rights Act, 65 with the Voting Rights Act. So that's about 9 decades. And in the midst of that period was, of course, the Second World War, when the United States, along with the Soviet Union, et cetera, went to war with the Axis powers. And I don't know how many people in the chat are familiar with the Double V campaign, but it was sort of one of the early events of the mid-20th civil rights movement. And effectively, it was Black soldiers asking for both victory against fascism abroad, victory against apartheid at home. And so you have, like, within the Double V campaign, you have you can kind of see like an ambivalent relation within the history of the United States that people have had to basically a sort of fidelity to a particular role that their state might be playing, or against, again, like foreign intervention or domination, and then also a commitment towards transforming their own society. And again, over a 9-decade period. And the reason I bring this up is because in Iran, it's been 4 decades since 1979, and we've again, I don't mean to speak for everyone. I know this is a very fraught and complicated terrain, but people have made a lot of gains in Iran, and that's just in the last 4 decades. So the idea that I think that most people who know American history, like, would it have helped the civil rights campaign if some foreign power were to come for the sake of saving Americans to bomb Little Rock or bomb Birmingham or bomb Georgia? I mean, like, that would have been, I think, in my opinion, that would have been counterproductive towards to the effort. And so there is a kind of historical analogy or parallel that's actually really present in there for us to think about, except for the fact of a kind of, I would say, enforced amnesia about the American history, basically, and the actual history of the mid-century civil rights movement. So I think that when we think of social transformation, our own impatience with the movement of history, displacing that impatience onto the idea that some deus ex, some foreign actor should just come in and save people by bombing the very political prisoners and women that they say that they want to speak, is both hypocritical and also betrays a profound ignorance about the history of social movements.
So, my 2 cents. Clearly, there is a lot that we still don't know. I think we'll learn a lot more when Pete Hegseth has another night out on the town and takes to Signal again. But I think one thing we do know is that each of the parties concluded that a durable ceasefire was either in its interests or could not be refused. And there I'm referring to Israel and its inability to reject an American decision that Washington considers to be in its vital national interest. But having said that, everything now depends on what happens in the political and diplomatic fields. Um, does the US feel that the events of the last 2 weeks have weakened Iran so that Iran will now accept what it has rejected? If that's the case, I think the stage has been set for the next phase. Or has the U.S. concluded that not only Israel but also the United States failed to break the will of the Iranians, and therefore must either find other means through which to weaken Iran, or alternatively has to change its negotiating position and go back to its former red line of seeking watertight assurances that Iran will not and cannot develop a nuclear bomb, while at the same time respecting Iran's rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and not seeking agreements on issues unrelated to the nuclear file. And for the Iranian side, given that they feel that despite the painful blows they've absorbed, that they have survived this and proven their mettle, will they now be prepared under certain conditions to return to the negotiating table, or will they conclude that the United States has proven itself so untrustworthy, repeatedly so, and that the Israelis need to be deterred more effectively and instead pivot to a nuclear breakout? I think those are important questions to answer. And for Israel, I think the events of last night showed that it's unlikely to succeed in imposing a Lebanese style ceasefire on Iran, where Iran is expected to strictly adhere to its terms, but Israel can violate it at will. At the same time, post October 7th, Israel has a new security doctrine, where its security doctrine was formally the possession of overwhelming military force in order to deter any potential adversary. Its current security doctrine is to use that overwhelming military force wherever there is a real or potential or emerging threat. I think that explains what it's done in Syria and so on. And I think in the short term, we should expect a renewed Israeli war on Lebanon. I consider that quite likely. And someone earlier made the point, I believe, today, that ultimately everything we're seeing now is because of the unresolved question of Palestine, and specifically the ongoing genocide in the Gaza Strip. Does that mean that the United States will now use its extraordinary influence and leverage over Israel to seek to bring that genocide in the end? Or will it compensate Israel for having halted its offensive against Iran by giving it a free hand and encouraging it to, quote unquote, all questions we should be looking at, and for which I don't think we're going to have to wait an extraordinarily long time to get an answer.
If anybody wants to jump in, please go ahead. Otherwise, I have a couple of things to say. We are all deflated, huh? This is different than the first event where it was like more fiery, and I guess people were more mad.
None of us have slept for a week, Bassam.
Yeah, I've been sleeping 22 hours a day. That's weird. Okay. Well, I would like, thank you all so much. I mean, I can't think of anything major that we did not address, but what I'd like to pinpoint a bit more are the things that, if you live in the United States and you are watching the news, you actually forget the basics. And I would like to go back to the basics in relation to the state that is responsible for the most part for what was been happening, which is Israel. And this is by no means to absolve the United States. Without its support, much of this wouldn't have been possible to begin with. But I'd like to address in in response to the narrative that's being floated at various levels in terms of who the perpetrators of war and aggression are, in terms of the question of what's next, especially that now Iran has learned the lesson regarding its proxies and it's going to keep them down, on the question of how the world is responding to this, and on the question of what Israel stands for. And then finally, in terms of what might be next for this idea that like Israel is now settled in the sense that it has also weakened Iran after the Syrian regime collapse, which was not playing any significant role in the last years, and that it degraded Hezbollah and so on. So first, I'd like to start by sharing that just like Holocaust deniers, genocide deniers, including Israel and the United States, cannot be trusted and will not be respected. Just like Holocaust deniers today, genocide deniers, including Israel and the United States and their interlocutors, cannot be trusted and will not be respected. After all, Israel is the principal culprit that is now committing this genocide with full US support, and is the state that has actually bombed the hell out of Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iran, killing thousands of people, upwards of 3,000 in Lebanon, still occupying parts of southern Lebanon, still occupying parts of southern Syria, in addition to the Golan Heights. And that's what the basic point is and continues to be, and has been for quite some time. Second, what is termed Iran's proxies, the idea that Iran is going to now control these proxies, or they're going to be controlled, the idea that these proxies are just an arm of Iran is completely overstated, even if Iran supplies support in various ways. They are, especially Hezbollah, far more independent than is assumed. Hezbollah's existence was prompted to begin with by Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon, and continues to be so, and will continue to be so. The relationship between Iran and Hezbollah serves to deter Israel, restore sovereignty, and liberate Palestine from the apartheid regime. And though none of the actors on Iran's side are flawless, and we have to be, straightforward about all these things. Nobody is talking about angels on any side. Their flaws, nonetheless, including Iran and Hezbollah, are a fraction of Israel's structural and decades-long racism and genocidal intent and practice now in full swing. Third, the hostility against the perpetrators of genocide will continue to precipitate and increase, but now with a renewed globally been significantly moved in terms of where it was and where it is now after the genocide and after these actions, regarding what Israel is and is not, notably in the United States, and notably among the demographics under 40, including among Jewish citizens of the United States, or Jews in the United States, which bodes quite ill for the Zionist state, despite its military upper hand, because now that's all that it has left compared to the veneer of all sorts of proclamations about how it's distinguished, as Assal and others said, by being a democracy. And fourth, and that's a very important point regarding the big picture regarding what Israel is and has been trying to say it is, in fact, Israel forever will be, to the extent that it continues to survive in its racist form, it will forever continue to be unsafe, which is the whole idea of Israel, supposedly, where this is the safest place for Jews in the world. Now it's the least safe place for anybody because of its actions, because of its apartheid rule, because of its ethnic cleansing, because of its genocide, because of its belligerence. So long as it does not dismantle its colonial existence, predicated on colonial ethno-supremacy, that's going to be the case. And to the dim-witted genocide deniers, dismantling apartheid does not mean genocide against Israel. It just means a chance or change in the racist regime it practiced, the racist rules of inequality, much like what happened in South Africa. It's not about free Palestine from the river to the sea. It's about equality from the river to the sea, not the elimination of the other per the dim-witted genocide deniers or Stefanik.
You obviously haven't been listening to Zohran Mamdani.
Well, I have. And finally, in the meantime, all victims of Israel's expansion, violence, and land grabs and genocide have learned a precious lesson from their prior mistakes and vow not to leave themselves open to them, as we have heard today and as we will see in Iran and beyond. The present day might be grim for any sort of social justice that so many of us seek, but Israel's future is most likely doomed. And I'm not one of the people who says it's happening soon, but it is happening, and it's its own making, and it's not a puzzle. So I just wanted to share these words because the context within which all of this is taking place is precisely this settler colonial existence and expansionist ethno-supremacist state. And much has been said about the United States and its relationship with Israel and why this has happened. So I'll stop here. Anyone has any other final comments?
Can I just say one thing to that?
Please,
I agree
say what
with
you like.
everything you said,
Jump in.
Bassam, but I think an added narrative here as well is the imperial hubris, right? This has been the problem with all empires, is they expand to the point where they disintegrate from within. And Israel knows that it needs to keep perpetual war to prevent its own internal demise. And enough people who know much more about Israel have written about this, but eventually that model stops working when the war fully comes back home. And unfortunately, that might be this moment, or fortunately.
And if I could just add a brief point, for 2 years, Israel has been destroying the Gaza Strip and perpetrating a genocide there. It attacked Lebanon and committed its destruction there and managed to enormously weaken Hezbollah and eliminate its leadership and so on. But now it was up against against a state with conventional military forces and so on. And I think many people will conclude that despite the overwhelming disparity in force between Israel and Iran, Iran essentially gave as good as as it got. And we now have a ceasefire, not because Iran was begging for one, even though it wanted one, but because its adversaries felt that one was necessary. And I'd be very curious in the months and years ahead if others in the region who have been looking at their leaders and questioning why their leaders have assumed the posture of inert and powerless spectators for the past 2 years, whether that might set in process some kind of dynamic. So I just wanted to raise that question as well.
Just another quick point, just to reinforce what's been said. I would argue that Netanyahu launching this war was actually a desperate gambit, and it did come from this situation of strategic deadlock for Israel. Like, I would argue, since October 7th, they haven't destroyed Hamas, they haven't destroyed Hezbollah. As we've discussed in this war with Iran, they haven't weakened Iran in the way that they wanted to weaken Iran, and Israel is left more isolated than ever. its dependency on America as its patron is more exposed than ever. Its vulnerability of its missile defense systems is more exposed than ever. And this is occurring in the context of the changing global order, as we discussed, where America, since 9/11, has been trying to transform the Middle East to make it more safe and secure for Israel and for continued American dominance. That project has failed. And this was, I think, the last desperate Hail Mary, when it seemed like Trump was on the verge of a framework nuclear deal with Iran in those talks that were supposed to occur last week. So I think what I would watch out for in the coming weeks is, as Mouin said, how will the posture of the other regional states change? Continuing to see the power of Iranian missiles and the cost of a conflict for them. Will they pivot even harder towards engagement and against war? I think they will. And then, America's global priority is China. China is the peer competitor. Even right now, I think one big motivating factor behind the ceasefire was the depleting interceptor missiles for Israel, especially the more higher altitude Arrow missiles, which they need those for China. And America only has a production capacity of about 100 of those a year. So, we are in this context where Netanyahu and the Israeli government has scapegoated Iran for decades, since the 90s, really, to use it as a boogeyman to justify its expansionist policies, its annexationist policies towards Palestinian territories, destroying the Oslo process and whatnot. But now it's like they've hit a dead end. Like, what are they're trying to openly do genocide. If they try to expel the Palestinians from the West Bank, Jordan's going to collapse. Like, they don't have any good options. America wants to leave the Middle East. They've hit a wall against America. Trump is I think all these Steve Bannon, Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson attacking Israel like this, that terrifies the Israelis. That is the big the big threat for them, because if they lose the American support, and now on the right in America, it's also becoming more polarized on Israel, as it did with the Democrats 10 years ago. So they're not in a good position, which is, in some ways, I agree, like, it's unsustainable what they're doing, Bassam, but they're also incredibly dangerous, and they have nuclear weapons. I described them in a previous interview as ISIS with nuclear weapons. They're religious zealots, many of them. They're ISIS with the unconditional support of the West and with nuclear weapons, and they engage in all kinds of slaughter and anything to kind of preserve this really untenable position. So I think something's got to give. Hopefully it's just that Netanyahu goes and, the U.S. applies pressure because America's aims have been to, foster, better ties with the Gulf countries, again, pivot to Asia. And Trump has kind of rebuked the Israelis with respect to, like, what they wanted in a relationship with Saudi Arabia. So if the Israelis are kind of humbled and move away from these policies, I think, in that case, it's still not sustainable, their project. But, this current approach they're on, I think, is very dangerous and self-destructive for their own interests.
Well, when the interest is to maintain apartheid rule, I mean, there's really kind of nothing in your interest in the long run. And I just want to say that regarding the people that are speaking out, whether it's Marjorie Taylor Greene or Joe Rogan and everybody in between, against what the U.S. is doing right now, and for in America first and all of that, and the others that are waking up, I'm personally not banking on any of these folks. Not because I don't think they're genuine; they are genuine, but the motivation is far less, especially within liberal America and those voices, because there are different kinds of voices. And liberal America worries me the most because of their pretense of legality and morality and democracy. Because
Even
all this
Chuck Schumer?
no, لا بس Chuck Schumer is different. حطه على جنب. No, but I'm not basically banking on any of these people, because their critique is based on the horror and on the serious shifts in terms of U.S. interests and policies in ways that don't sort of benefit the U.S. It is not based on the actual original problem of dispossession, ethnic cleansing, and racism in dealing with the Palestinians in Israel, Palestine, in Israel proper, within Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and of course the Palestinians outside. This is the problem. And a lot of these people, their critique is mainly about other things, whereas, or in such a way where if Israel stops the violence, stops attacking other countries, stops its genocide completely in Gaza, it is still a problem because of the way things are, whereby you have a subjugated population by a belligerent, militarily occupying force that distinguishes and dehumanizes and so on. This is the issue. That's why we cannot bank on a lot of the shifts in the United States by individuals and groups, because they see the cessation of genocide as the issue, not actually the structure of racism that has existed for 7.5 and more decades. All right. I guess if anybody has any last words, we can do it. Otherwise, we'll watch our TVs for any potential changes. Anybody here thinks that I don't think the ceasefire is going to be broken for reasons that have to do with the position of the United States, now symbolized by Trump. Does anyone here feel that the ceasefire will be broken?
Under normal circumstances, I would agree with you, but you do have this very powerful and determined coalition consisting of Trump and the Israel and its loyalists in Washington.
Yeah, but
and so on.
I'm talking about like in the short run. I mean,
Yes.
Of course, it's going to be broken
Yes.
ultimately, but
No, I'm talking about the short run. And it's unclear whether they'll pull the rabbit out of the hat, or whether this time they'll be put in their place. I mean, with any other administration, I wouldn't hesitate to agree with you, but I think this one is so volatile and unpredictable that while I, in principle, agree with you, I think we also should expect the unexpected, because it could happen at any moment.
okay. Sina,
I would also argue that
go ahead, Sina.
I would say the factors that contributed to this ceasefire, like America not being able to and not wanting to enter a big regional war, a regime change war, not wanting Persian Gulf stability to be affected, regional stability, wanting to focus more on these other kind of strategic priorities. I think those factors are only going to become more pronounced. And now with these reports coming out now about these B-52 bombings apparently didn't really destroy Fordo. It's just the limits of a military solution to Iran's nuclear program and these issues with Iran. So that makes me more optimistic about a diplomatic, a kind of broader diplomatic settlement becoming more viable between Iran and the U.S. and not, the ceasefire being broken. But with that said, I don't discount the madman Netanyahu, and in his desperation, again, doing another thing to throw all this, but then, at that point, it's just a question of, will Trump react even more strongly to him? And that's what Netanyahu would have to be gambling with.
Just to add to that, I want to say, because I agree with both Mouin and Sina, that you have two unpredictable actors. Trump is unpredictable because he doesn't have like an ideological point of view, and he thinks transactionally. And so if he thinks something he's doing is going to benefit him, then he'll do it. And if he doesn't think it's going to, he won't. So, and I think those are the calculations that he's making, right? His calculation was, I'm just going to go in and hit these sites. That way I can tell everybody that I destroyed their nuclear program, but we're not going to get into a bigger war. And this way I win all around. I supported Israel. I destroyed Iran's nuclear program. I didn't start a longer war. No one within, especially his own camp that was split, can be mad. On the side of Netanyahu, the motivation is actually purely ideological, and he's a genocidal maniac. And so once you've crossed the threshold of genocide and just very, very openly committing it, I don't think that there's any limitation to what he's willing to do. The difference, though, with Iran and, say, Lebanon, and obviously in the case of Gaza, is that Iran can hit back. I mean, and that's what they've shown. and that might be the only thing, because it's creating a lot of cost in Israel, and they're sort of not used to it. They're used to just, destroying everyone else and nothing happening to Israel. And now that a cost is being exacted, then I think that is what's changing the calculus. And I also think that's part of what changes the calculus on the US side as well. It's Iran has focused directly on Israel, except for the one attack yesterday that we saw that was a retaliation that was telegraphed so that nothing would actually happen. But what the last 2 weeks have shown is, when we've seen Iran in the past have these very measured, calibrated responses to aggression by Israel or the United States, a lot of times I think in the US, this was interpreted as their weakness or inability to hit something if they wanted to hit it. But now we're seeing a completely different scenario where, well, actually, I guess they can hit things if they want to hit them. And those attacks were carried out for very specific reasons. And all of that, I think, changes it and is distinct from the other Israeli aggressions you've seen in the region where they haven't had to pay a price.
Negar and Naveed, would you like to weigh in on whether, well, let's say the short run, at least in my mind, is equivalent to the number of days the war had taken place, like in the next, week to 2 weeks. Do you think it will hold?
I think it's okay for us to say we have no idea, Like, I think it's okay.
Nobody knows.
We're dealing with someone who, I don't even want to insult children by saying he's a child, but he has literally changed the entire reason for, and by he I'm referring to Trump, his whole reason for why the US is involved in the first place every 6 hours. And I don't think we have to play by his game. Like, we can also try to shift the narrative so that so his choices become more and more restrained as he moves forward.
Naveed, you have the last word. So everybody's going to hang on every single syllable you utter.
Yeah, I mean, speculation. Speculation is useful if you're in a position where it's of an existential matter, and in those cases, yeah, you have to make a gamble about what decision the other party is going to make. So, if you're Iran, then it's not necessarily it's not going to be like an academically grounded speculation. It's just going to be based on, the vibes, the vibes at the time. But that's not who I am. And this is not that situation. Like in an academic sort of, as an academic or in a scholarly mode, I typically just try to restrict myself to hindsight. The owl of Minerva always flies at dusk, as they say. And so, I won't call the day until the sun sets, I guess. But I can just say what I hope, which is that I hope not only that there is a ceasefire, but I hope that the genocide stops, and that that's probably like my most short-term hope. But that's all I can say for now. Yeah, like hopefully there isn't a war though, because war means death, and that's all. But I think that Sina and Mouin and Assal are on point though, in terms of providing us the insights we need to have just a sense of what might happen. So thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. I cannot, thank you enough. Actually, you've all been extremely responsive to our, calls for these conversations. I hope we don't meet again, because this means that this is still ongoing in this particular way. Otherwise, we could meet to address other issues. Of course, this is co-sponsored and co-organized by the Palestinian Context project, which you see on the screen, palestiniancontext.org. And we are hoping to follow this with a short pedagogy series on Iran, in which we learn more about Iran's history, the relationship with the United States, maybe some specific conversations about nuclear weapons for civilian use or otherwise, because this is still an issue that a lot of people are confused about in terms of enrichment of uranium and the
You mean
percentages that are
nuclear energy for civilian use?
nuclear. Did I say weapons?
Yes.
Oh, I'm being genocidal. I'm going to lose my job now. Yeah, I meant nuclear energy. So we will be doing this soon about basically a pedagogic approach. So I hope you can join us. Thank you all. Thanks to everyone who's listening and watching. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and peace and solidarity always. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Assal, Negar, Naveed, Sina, and Mouin.
Thank you.
Salam.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Right.